All right. Well, today on the program, we are going to get a little bit of Old Testament in our system. We are going to be looking at a passage in 1 Kings chapter 17, having to do with Elijah during the famine in Israel. And even more so focused on, not exclusively, but in a lot of ways focused on him and the Widow of Zarephath and just what that account says about the God that we serve. Ultimately, what I want us to see as we study this passage is just who our God is. Obviously, not meaning that in a comprehensive sense. You're not going to get a totality of information on God in this one passage, obviously, or any other individual or selected passage. But I want us to be aware of God and his sovereignty and his rule over all and everything. And I kind of approached this passage, in light of some of the things that we're going through today. Now, I'm not saying that the text that we're going to look at is a one-for-one pattern on how God will operate in 21st century America. Or anything like that. But I do want us to grasp an overall principle that I think can be grasped from this passage, which I think that many of us may be able to relate to, just given just the current state of our society today. So I think that there's some good things in store. So I hope you stay with us. My name is Steve Gill, and you're listening to Loving the Scriptures. All right. Well, as you know, or as you may know, maybe you don't know if you're a first-time listener, but as you may know, we are taking a break from our regular study of the book of Revelation. We are in the middle of chapter 19 right now. We've finished up, we've gone through verse 10. That's where we left off last time. We're going to pick up in verse 11 in a couple of weeks, but now we're just going to cover some other things, take a break, take a deep breath before diving headlong back into Revelation. And again, every once in a while we go ahead and take breaks just to get a little bit of a variety from God's Word. I'm really excited about just some of the things that I want to point out in the passage that we're going to look at today, which I think it will be very fruitful and profitable for us. But before we do that, you know what time it is. Listen, we might be taking a break from Revelation, but we are not taking a break from the shameless plug. And the shameless plug is of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? You can get it on Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I'm sure you can get it on, in other websites as well. Those are the two main ones. As usual, I will leave a link in the comment description. In the episode description, so that will take you right to the Amazon page, so you can go ahead and place an order for that book. Again, it's a book on the Olivet Discourse, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. You may wonder why I usually refer to Mark first when I give those passages, Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. And that's because the Mark 13 passage, the version of the Olivet Discourse, is the main passage that I draw from. And the reason why I do that is that a lot of what I write in the book is based on a teaching I did on a Sunday evening study for a few weeks during a teaching through the book of Mark, which wasn't taught by me. It was taught by somebody else, but somebody else wanted me to teach through Mark 13, knowing that I had a different end times outlook than a lot of the other people did. So just based on that, that's my go-to. Although obviously, though, I do draw from comparisons from the other synoptic accounts as well, in Matthew 24 and Luke 21. So none of you may have been wondering that, but in case you did, that's why I say Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21. Maybe on a couple of occasions I might have gone in the order, as it shows up in our Bibles: Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21. But my go-to is usually Mark 13, Matthew 24, Luke 21, and that's just because Mark 13 is the main passage that I draw from. So, but anyway, be sure to pick up a copy of that book, read it, and be blessed. Okay, so I mentioned before, just related to what we're going to talk about and what we're going to look at here in 1 Kings chapter 17. That it was, this is something that a lot of us may be able to relate to, just given the things that are going on in our world. Now, I realize that saying that now, at the time of this recording, there can be a lot that happens between the time of this recording and when the episode actually drops, because news is just so fast paced. And this isn't anything having to do with, this isn't anything that's new. Let me just lay out to you what, how I came about to decide to talk about this passage here. And we're looking mainly at, I said 1 Kings chapter 17, verses 1 through 16. And that was 1 Kings chapter 17 was part of my regular, just my own personal reading, just reading through the Bible. And I was reading through this maybe a couple weeks ago, maybe. I don't remember exactly how long. It wasn't too long ago. So really what we're looking at here, was inspired by just through my regular reading, just on my own personal reading through the Bible, and my own time in the Word. And I remember as I was reading 1 Kings chapter 17, the one thing that came up in my mind, and it just stuck to me like glue as I was reading this, is just thinking about that and just kind of everything going on as it relates to our economy. Now, this is not, 1 Kings 17 is not a passage on what God does in the midst of economic crisis. That's not what I'm saying. And I'm not, and again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the intention here is not to make a one-for-one comparison between the things going on in Israel and today, in that passage and today, and also what God did in 1 Kings chapter 17 and today, and saying God will do exactly this here that we see in this passage and do it here in 21st century America. But I couldn't help but think about where we are economically as a nation, and I think you and I are all aware that this economy, as it exists right now, is in dire straits. And like I said, that's not anything that's new. I mean, this isn't breaking news or anything. Actually, the breaking news right now, and again, this, at the time of this recording, is the whole leak, Supreme Court leak, and the potential of Roe versus Wade being overturned. That's got the major headlines, just in the past day or two, and even today, and might still, going up into to the time that this episode drops. Which, by the way, just to hit the pause button on what I'm saying, what the direction we're going. But just speaking of that, it's just really interesting to me, not a surprise, but it's interesting to me, when the abortion issue takes center stage in our society today, and you have many of the people who are pro-choice, and they lose their minds because they think that people are trying to impose on them this whole thing of you can't kill your child, you can't kill your baby. And the whole thing of the pro-choice side rubbing me the wrong way, I have more, I would say, compassion on somebody who's pregnant, maybe even a young person who's pregnant, scared out of their minds, and not knowing what to do, and the first thing that they think is go get an abortion. Now, I'm not saying that they should. I'm just saying that my heart goes out to them more. I would hope that somebody or people in their lives would stop them from doing that, because even though they're in that situation, abortion is still wrong. It's killing a baby. So, I'm not defending abortion in that in any way. But there's people like that, and then there's people who are militantly pro-choice, and all the whole thing about my body and, hands off my uterus and all that sort of thing. And these people, the level of anger that they have when they feel like their quote unquote right to choose, their quote unquote right to have an abortion, their right to kill a baby, when they feel that right, again, quote unquote, is infringed upon, they get so angry. And the anger is kind of that kind of surprises me somewhat. And I say somewhat because on one side, it's really not too much of a surprise because, really at the end of the day, what you're dealing with is rampant wickedness and depravity. But even so, you would like to think like on a basic human level, just think about it. They are getting so angry and upset because they think that women won't be able to kill their kids. Now, in reality, the overturning of Roe versus Wade would just turn things over to the states. Doesn't mean that in all states abortion is going to go away. But in some, just to underscore that. But even so, when you have the abortion issue center stage, and you have the pro-life versus pro-choice in the debate, and you see a lot of pro-choicers, and not everybody, but a lot of pro-choicers who in the debate, they get so angry because there are people on the other side who think that a baby shouldn't be killed in the womb. And that just blows my mind. It's like, and I look at that and I'm like, wait, hold on. Why are you angry? Why are you mad? Your side are not the people that should be mad. We should be mad because you are killing innocent life in the womb. So the anger on the other side is just mind-boggling to me. Again, I understand the spiritual nature of things, and this what you're dealing with is utter wickedness and depravity. But if you really think about it on its basic level, it's just weird. You have people are getting mad because they think, hey, you're telling me I can't kill my kid. They won't put it like that. And sometimes they'll use euphemisms and they'll deny that it's a life. But I think a lot of these people deep down know that it's a life in the womb. And getting mad about it, about what pro-lifers believe, and saying that you shouldn't kill the baby in the womb, it's it's beyond words for me. And it's like, why are you angry? We should be angry because of what your side is doing. So, anyway, that's just kind of throwing my 2 cents in there. But that's the hot topic in the news that's taking center stage right now at the time of this recording. But that doesn't change what we've been feeling throughout, for several weeks now. Abortion issue or not, this is something that's going on and still going to go on. It's probably going to persist for a while. The main focus here is on inflation, and it's really putting a hurt, and has put a hurt on people, and is still doing that today. I remember, I really don't a lot of times speak about things economically and drawing things from the Bible and what the Christian response should be. But I did do that a while back. I don't know if any of you faithful listeners remember this, but back when COVID was just really kind of in its heyday, I guess. And, I dedicated a whole episode of looking at, Jesus' words in Matthew 6 about do not worry about your life, because I was approaching this not from the whole thing of being at peace related to COVID, the illness itself, the infection itself, but what this whole thing was going to do economically. Because again, there were a lot of people who were locking down back when lockdowns really wasn't objected to all around, because we were still trying to figure out what this whole thing was all about, kind of, sort of. But you had a lot of people who were locking down. You had a lot of businesses that were closing. And so the emphasis back then was on unemployment, okay? And I was taking an episode to look at a biblical point of view of saying, should we as Christians worry given the downturn in the economy because of everything going on with COVID and certain policies and decisions and things like that. And I said no, and was drawing from Matthew 6. So, I mean, again, I guess you can say I'm kind of doing the same thing here, except the emphasis is a little bit different. You have a different text and that sort of thing. But again, we're in a situation here where higher prices. And listen, you probably are aware of it just as much as I am when you go to the grocery store or you go, to buy other products and services and things like that. That, man, things are starting to put a pinch on your wallet. And just from reports and everything, it doesn't look like anything's gonna resolve anytime soon. And so you have a lot of people, and that puts people in a lot of an economic struggle, and puts many people into an economic and financial hardship. And in a way, when I was thinking about that and thinking about this passage, I guess you could say that this is somewhat along the same theme of what we're talking about as it related to our study of Matthew chapter 6, where Jesus was saying, do not worry about your life, what you will eat or drink, or what your body, what you will wear. It's along the same theme, but we're approaching it from a different angle here. And again, this is just drawn from just my own regular reading, just in reading through the Bible. I happened to be reading through 1 Kings, came up on chapter 17, was reading this passage, and then that and just everything that we're dealing with now just kind of intersected, okay? And so I really was thinking about it. And then when we came up on this break from Revelation, I thought, well, maybe I'll just share this passage here and talk about it a little bit. And I think that this would be something that hopefully would be timely and something that would be encouraging, just given where we are right now. Now, again, let me just warn you here. And just remind you that what we're not doing here is we're not saying, okay, in all economic crises, this is what God does here, and so forth and so on. I mean, and really just having to acknowledge that the point of, the point of this passage isn't necessarily zeroed into, the things that we're going to be talking about now. We're just looking at one chapter in a broader narrative of First Kings. Well, actually, First and Second Kings, because that's all one story. And really, there's other things that are going on that we won't make much of an emphasis on. But again, really, what I want us to gather from this is just God's sovereignty and control, even when times are tough, and how He still has His eye out, for people who are His own. Now, in the context of 1 Kings chapter 17, those who were His own and who were walking faithfully with the Lord, I mean, really, it's just a small handful of people. You had Elijah here, and then maybe you had a company of prophets that a guy named Obadiah was hiding during this time because Jezebel was on the manhunt looking for these prophets of God to kill. But really, that's really where I want us to focus on. Is God and how and just who He is and what He is able to do, so that even in the toughest times, whether we're talking about what we see in 1 Kings 17 or anything that we might be experiencing here as it relates to our context, that God is in control. And I know that just saying that might sound a little bit cliche, but it's so true. And we get to see in different areas here, in a few different areas here of this passage, just how amazing that is, and how God can unleash His purposes as it relates to judgment on the nation of Israel, and also at the same time protecting His prophet Elijah. And that's really what I want you to see. And that's another disconnect. I don't know if disconnect is the right word, but that's kind of a disconnect of what what's going on in the text and what we're experiencing now. Here we're in chapter 17 of 1 Kings. We're talking about this happening during a time of judgment against God's covenant people who are breaking covenant with God because of everything that they were doing. And King Ahab was at the head of the line as far as that goes. And I say it's kind of a disconnect between then and what's happening now, because you could speculate that the things that we're going through right now as a nation is part of God's judgment. I in no way discount that possibility at all. Whether he's directly doing things or just withdrawing his hand and allowing certain things to happen, it's certainly within the realm of possibility that it's for the purpose of judgment against the nation, or, as a certain way of humbling our nation and humbling the people within our nation. Perhaps is one of the purposes that God has. Now, I can't say for sure, yes, this is what God is doing. So I want to be careful with what I say about that and how I declare that. And again, as far as it relates to the United States, I mean, the United States is not a covenant people of God under covenant relationship with God. That's another difference. So again, we have to understand, we have to recognize the differences between what we're looking at in Scripture and, how this might speak to us today. So I just want to make that clear and bring that up. We're not making a one-for-one comparison on what God will do, what God has, and what God will do in our situation and what God has done. I just want us to understand that God is able, even in the toughest times. And even if that means what we're going through here, if it's really hitting you in a significant way, and you're starting to feel it, God is in control. So everything, even the things that we don't like feeling in this whole thing, is not outside of God's control. And even in that, God is perfectly capable of taking care of his own. Okay. I guess maybe that's kind of the best way to really put it there. So having said all that, though, let's go to the text here. And let me start out with reading verses 1 through 7 of 1 Kings 17. And this actually right here is the first time that Elijah is introduced into the narrative in 1 Kings here. So, I mean, from here until, 2 Kings chapter, I want to say 2 or 3, from here to that point, Elijah is a prominent figure in the story in which you see going on here. But he's introduced here. This is his first appearance here in the book here in chapter 17. This is what it says here, starting in verse 1. It says, "Now Elijah the Tishbite of Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, As the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. And the word of the Lord came to him, Depart from here and turn eastward, and hide yourself by the brook Kerith, which is east of the Jordan. You shall drink from the brook, and I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So he went and did according to the word of the Lord. He went and lived by the brook of Kerith, that is east of the Jordan. And the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. And after a while, the brook dried up, because there was no rain in the land. Okay, so there's, before we even get to the whole thing of Elijah and this widow here, we see the situation at play here. And the first thing that I want you to understand is, and I'm laying this out and by no means expecting this to be a surprise or an earth-shattering revelation or anything like that. But I mean, as long as we're talking about this whole thing of God being in control and God being sovereign, we see this right here at the very beginning. Where it says that when Elijah said to Ahab, as the Lord, the God of Israel, lives, before whom I stand, there shall be neither dew nor rain these years, except by my word. Okay, and from other places in Scripture, we know that the length of time where this rain didn't come and you had this drought was 3.5 years. Okay, that's a long time. For a drought, and it would certainly be devastating. Now we learn from places like James chapter 5, and I'll just read this to you here, that this was according to a prayer that Elijah had prayed that to God that this would happen. In James chapter 5, verse 17. Let me read verses 17 and 18. It says, Elijah was a man with a nature like ours, and he prayed fervently that it might not rain. And for 3 years and 6 months it did not rain on the earth. Then he prayed again, and heaven gave rain, and the earth bore its fruit. Now understand, all of this is by the hand of God, even though this is through the prayer of Elijah. And even here, Elijah says, that there shall be neither dew nor rain for these years, except by my word. It's not like Elijah has this authority in and of himself. I mean, this is something that he prayed for, and God granted that prayer. And this isn't, we obviously know how prayer works. This isn't Elijah ordering God around. But because this was according to God's will, God allowed this to happen and answered Elijah's prayer. So God having the ability, again, we're not surprised by this, but having the ability to shut the sky and keep rain from falling on the earth, it really helps us to really understand that there are a lot of things as far as it relates to nature, the hydrological cycle and everything like that we might take for granted, that God actually uses and actually does himself in order for people to grow food and to sell food and all those sorts of things. God is one who's operating all of those things. And sometimes we might not really appreciate it until those things are taken away, that among other things. But all this to say that this is ultimately by the hand of God. Yes, through the prayer of Elijah, but God's hand is the one who has the power and the ability to do this. And so by God's doing, the rain is shut off, and it's shut off for a long time. Okay, so God has control even of that, even in that non-ideal situation. Now, again, this is all, we're dealing with an apostate northern kingdom that is not living right. And it's no wonder, given the fact that King Ahab is their king. He's one of the most wicked kings in Israel. You'll get a sense of that even when you read places like 1 Kings 26. But so there you have that there. And so, but what we're going to see in this situation is God taking care of Elijah. Even though the sky is shut, rain isn't falling down, this is a hardship for many people. God has his eye out on Elijah here. And so the instruction there, verses 2 and following, it says, "And the word of the Lord came to him, depart from here and turn eastward and hide yourself by the brook Cherith, which is east of the Jordan." And he says, "You shall drink from the brook." Now listen to this, middle of verse 4. "And I have commanded the ravens to feed you there." So there's another aspect of things where God is in control. And it's just interesting that, just the way that's phrased here, there, where God says, "I have commanded the ravens to do this." Now, obviously, where it's not a whole thing where the ravens are like, "Hey, Lord, what do you want me to do?" And, God says, "Go and do this." It's not like that. It's just that God has sovereign control over his creation. And in that way, there's a command sense whereby in his sovereignty and in his providence, he unfolds things so that even dumb animals, and by dumb, I'm saying like, animals that don't think like humans, God leads these animals to do his will. He leads these birds to do his will. So he says, "I have commanded ravens to feed you there." Now, maybe, I don't know, just depending on where you live, in whatever location you are, maybe vacation somewhere, maybe if you're on a beach or, in a park somewhere, you have people who might feed birds or they might feed pigeons and stuff. I mean, we usually think if there's any sort of feeding from one to another, it's usually from the human to the bird. You throw out breadcrumbs and things or seeds or that sort of thing, and the birds come and they eat what you throw out there. So you're feeding the birds, and they're getting their fill of whatever it is that they want to eat. Now here you see the roles are reversed, and you see how, and according to God's hand, that's exactly how he can make things happen. And so you see there in verse 5, so he says, so he went and did according to the word of the Lord. And notice just the faith response there. Just God says, "Do this," and he did it. He went and lived by the brook Cherith, that is east of the Jordan, and the ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. So God has Elijah's back. All right, he's got water from the brook. And the question is, where in the world is Elijah going to find food? Well, he doesn't have to find food. He's commanded the ravens to bring him bread and meat in the morning and the evening. So God has that covered. He has that taken care of. Okay. And that's God's provision. Now, again, this is an example where I'm not saying that we're making one-for-one comparisons, because as the economy will continue to go in the direction that it's going, and it starts to put a hurt on your pocketbook and everything like that, we're not saying that God is going to bring ravens to drop, food at your windowsill and that sort of thing. Although if he wanted to do that, he could. The main point is a general one, is what I'm trying to say here, is that God looks after his own, even in a situation like even with Elijah here. Again, the question could be asked, where am I going to get food? And in this case, you don't have to worry about it. Elijah didn't have to worry about it. God commanded the ravens to come and feed him. And this also shouldn't be something to tell us where if we're hitting up on hard times, then you just become lazy and you just sit down and lay back and say, okay, don't worry. God is gonna take care of something, that sort of thing. This isn't a call to laziness and saying, well, Elijah didn't have to do anything, so maybe I don't have to do anything either. Look at this from the point of the general. Elijah is obeying a specific command that was given to him by God. God is the one saying, hey, go to the brook and I'll take care of this here. I don't think God is going to be telling you or me or anybody else, hey, just stop working, just lay back. I'll take it from here. He could if he wanted to, but again, we're dealing with other circumstances here, other kinds of people. We're talking about a prophet here versus, so there's all sorts of different factors, obviously, to take into account. And I think that you understand that, but I feel like I just sometimes need to cover my bases here so people don't take what I'm saying and then run with it in a wrong direction and saying, oh, okay, because of what Steve taught, just say, okay, you can just sit down on your couch or your bed or something like that, do nothing, don't worry. The quote unquote ravens, whatever that'll look like, will fall on my doorstep. That's not what we're talking about. But what we're talking about is that in dire cases of need, how God can still provide for his people. Okay. So there's no rain and there's a drought, and there's a drought for a long time. What's going to become of Elijah? God, and again, we have to understand that this was something that Elijah prayed for. So that's another thing that's a difference between that and here. But again, with the sky shut up, nobody's able to grow food effectively or anything like that. You can ask the question, well, what's going to happen with Elijah? God's like, don't worry, I got it. Go to the brook. That's going to be your water source, and your food source is going to come from the ravens. Again, which is something that we normally don't think about. We usually think about it the other way around, but that shows all the more how much God is in control. And he can take things like these ravens here to do his will, to provide for one of his own. Okay. And that's what you have going on there. So that's kind of the principle, the overall principle that I want you to see just from this passage here. But then as we go further here, and here we get into the whole thing of the widow of Zarephath. Okay, and here's the other thing, and again, this should show us a little bit of the difference of what we're seeing between the text here and today, and just showing that the text has its own point as you continue to read, and that is that God, in bringing judgment on Israel in the form of this famine, was willing to reveal himself to Gentiles who didn't naturally know him, which is amazing. And Jesus even alludes to this in Luke chapter 4 when he's reading in the synagogue. If you remember that story, where he's driven out after what he said there. But one of the things that really drew the synagogue goers, made them go kind of crazy and insane, was this idea and this suggestion that God had in the past reached out to Gentiles and not to the people of Israel. And the idea was that it was during times of judgment. And Jesus was making parallels between that and the Jewish, the Israelite people of his day, and particularly even to the people that he was reading to. But in Luke chapter 4 and in verse 24, he says, and he said, truly I say to you, no prophet is acceptable in his hometown. But in truth, I tell you, there were many widows in Israel in the days of Elijah, when the heavens were shut up 3 years and 6 months, and a great famine came over all the land. And Elijah was sent to none of them, but only to Zarephath in the land of Sidon, to a woman who was a widow. And that, in addition to what the other example that he uses of Naaman in the healing of him with leprosy, sets the synagogue goers off, because Jesus' implication here is that God turned his back on Israel for a time during that time of judgment and reached out to Gentiles, who the normal Jew of that day would have thought were accursed people and would not even be close to being privileged people within the kingdom. In fact, they thought that a lot of them would be judged when the Messiah would come. So, but anyway, that's what we're dealing with here with Elijah coming. Not only for Elijah's sake, so to find food and everything, but even for the sake of this woman who God reveals himself to through Elijah, and even in the next passage here that we're not going to look at, verses 17 through 24, and just God revealing himself and showing his power, to the point where the woman says in verse 24, it says, and the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord is in your mouth is truth, which is something that is totally the opposite attitude of the Israelites in that area. Okay, but anyway, in verse 7 here, it says, and after a while the brook dried up because there was no rain in the land. So now the water source is gone. So you can have the ravens coming and feeding bread and meat all day long, but where are you going to get water? You're going to need water to survive. And you can go a little while without any food, but not so long without any water. So what are you going to do if there's no water? The brook is dried up. And so is God worried? Nope, not at all. So you get into verse 8, it says, then the word of the Lord came to him, arise, go to Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, and dwell there. Behold, now here again, this is in the middle of verse 9, the same language that he's using, except this is toward a person and not toward birds. But he says, behold, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Now, when you read the following verses, we see and we understand that the widow has no clue of what this is all about, of God leading her to do anything. That's not within her framework. The woman is just minding her own business. But again, this is God in his power and his sovereignty and his providence, intentionally using this woman to meet Elijah's needs, and in the process, her needs are going to be taken care of as well. Okay, so this isn't a matter of where before God gives Elijah to this command, where he first reveals himself to the widow and says, hey, I got this guy named Elijah. He's going to be coming your way. And he's going to need some food, so I'm going to ask you to do A, B, C, or D to provide for his needs, blah, 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 blah. That's not what we're dealing with here. It's just God has everything under control. He knows how he's going to meet Elijah's needs. And in bringing that out by his own providence, his own will, his own power, his own authority, his own sovereignty, he says, I have commanded this woman to do that. And by golly, this is what's going to happen here. Okay. Now, it's interesting here because God could have sent him anywhere. Now, he didn't send him to anywhere in Israel because, again, the circumstances at that time, they were under judgment. But even within Zarephath, which belonged to Sidon, you would think, okay, the brook is dried up. Now where am I going to go? Now I'm commanded to go to Sidon. You could go to anybody there. Now, the land that they're at, the famine's hitting them too. The hardship is hitting them as well, okay? And you could go to anybody, and even though they're struggling, they might be able to help you out a little bit, but they're still struggling. Now, you take the average struggling person in the midst of a famine, and you multiply that exponentially, seemingly, when it comes to a widow. Because widows were poor. Widows would be poor in that time even without the famine. But you have a widow, combine that with a famine, now you have somebody who's really in dire straits. And we're going to see that here in the passage there. So of all the people that God sends Elijah to, he sends him to a woman who's super poor. Let's just use that term. Everybody's struggling because everybody's under the same famine. The famine that Israel is going through is the same kind that these people inside are going to be going through. But of all the people, God decides to send Elijah to a widow. From a human perspective, that doesn't make sense, but you have to understand what kind of God we serve, right? Is this impossible in God's eyes? No. And God can give the command and say, and this isn't how it rolled out. I mean, we understand what he meant by I commanded her. It's like he's going to unfold it on his own power. But, he's commanding and saying, woman, lady, you are to do this, according to my power. I mean, again, that's not how it unfolded. That's not the interaction that happened. But that with the authority and the power that God has, he's able to do that with this woman who has no idea that she's being used of God when this whole thing starts to go down. Okay. And so, so he's commanded her, commanded a widow there. He says, I have commanded a widow there to feed you. Now, verse 10, so he arose and went to Zarephath. And when he came to the gate of the city, behold, a widow was there gathering sticks. And he called to her and said, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. And that's one of the big things that he needed, because again, the brook had dried up. So, he needs to go somewhere else where somebody else might have access to water, even if it's a little bit, whatever. He says, bring me a little water in a vessel that I may drink. Verse 11, and as she was going to bring it, he called to her and said, bring me a morsel of bread in your hand. Now, this is where Elijah has hit up on, something, the one area that from the widow's mind, and even for looking at this from a human perspective, from a human point of view, this is something that she could not do. Okay? Because it says there in verse 12, it says, and she said, as the Lord your God lives. And notice, she recognizes that, that this guy is an Israelite. He serves a God. He serves the God, the Lord God. But he says, as the Lord your God lives. And so this is a God that you guys worship, not me. So there's that acknowledgement there. I don't think we should be surprised at that. There's an acknowledgement there, of the God that Elijah serves. It says, as the Lord your God lives, I have nothing baked, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little oil in a jug. Now that's not much. You're not going to be able to produce much. And you get the sense of that, obviously, as you continue to go on. He says, and now I am gathering a couple of sticks that I may go in and prepare it for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Now, if you're talking about a handful of flour and a little bit of oil, it's not going, the sense that you get here is that's not going to make much. Even with what they are able to make, if it's as small as the impression that we might get from that saying of the widow, the sense is that, it's not going to be enough to fill both her and her son, but yet she's going to prepare it so that they can have just that little bit. And they're on their last leg there. They're going to use up everything. And then after that, she says, when we're going to die. So really, if that's the case, we're just talking about a last meal here. And, anybody in the widow's case might think, why not just get it over with? We're only delaying the inevitable here, and, whatever the case may be. But she's saying, look, this is the plan that I have here. We don't have much. You get the sense that even if she had enough, she would provide something, even if it was a little bit for Elijah. But she says, I only have enough for a little bit for me and my son. And that's what I'm concentrating on. So we're just going to eat that. And then after that, we're just going to call it game over. And then we're going to die. Because even after that, hunger is going to come back and there's going to be nothing, so forth and so on. But Elijah, not deterred in one way, and he's not deterred because he's anchored on what God actually says, and he actually brings forth and tells the widow what the Lord God has said. So in verse 13 it says, "And Elijah said to her, 'Do not fear. Go and do as you have said.'" So he's saying, yeah, you can actually do that. You can actually go fix what you need for yourself and your son. But first, okay, so it's interesting. Elijah is inserting himself here, as a priority over herself and her son. Now, how can Elijah so boldly do this? How can he boldly say, "But first, make me a little cake, make me a little cake of it and bring it to me, and afterward make something for yourself and your son"? How can he say, because she's already said, "We only have enough for me and my son. We're going to eat it and we're going to die." Because of verse 14, "For thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, the jar of flour shall not be spent and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day that the Lord sends rain upon the earth." So in other words, you're covered throughout the whole time this whole thing is going on. Which again, if you think about it within the biblical context, that's a big thing that God is doing for a Gentile people and not for the covenant people of Israel. So this is all part of what God is commanding, these things to do. And by the way, this shows us that God is Lord over everyone. And again, I don't think you'll get much dispute from Christians or anything like that. I mean, I'm saying something here and, you're nodding your head and saying, yeah, I agree with that absolutely. But when it comes to reading the Old Testament, a lot of us just have a tendency of like God, God's commands, his workings, everything like that. Israel, 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 Israel. And of course, a lot goes into God and his relationship with Israel, his lordship over the nation of Israel and that sort of thing. But let that not take away from the focus that God is Lord over everyone, so that even outside of Israel, he can command this Gentile woman here, provide food for my prophet here, and she's able to do it. Not by anything of her resources. She hardly has any resources, but God, working through her, saying that, okay, this is how I'm going to provide. And Elijah's saying that the flour is just going to keep coming and coming and coming. I really would have liked to have known what that looked like. You have a jar, you have, just a small handful. You get what you need, you do what you do. And then when you open the jar again, it's like just full of flour that wasn't there before. I mean, it's just, that truly would have been something to behold. But only God can do that. And in the not so, good times where, everybody's asking, where am I going to get food? How am I going to put food on the table? Here's God revealing himself to this widow and providing for his own prophet. And God through Elijah the prophet saying it's not gonna run out. And not just for this instance, this is for the whole time that this famine is going to persist. Now, I don't know where exactly within that 3.5 years that there are, but I mean, even so, it doesn't matter. That's still pretty amazing, pretty generous, and pretty gracious of our God as well. Because let's get something straight here, just as it relates to the widow here. Just because God is currently judging Israel and he's revealing himself to this Gentile woman doesn't mean that this Gentile woman within the land of Zarephath, which belongs to Sidon, doesn't mean the Sidonians were in and of themselves righteous people either. So it's not like God is doing this because the widow deserves it. But again, it does show how he has concern for revealing himself to all peoples, not just Israel, and being Lord over every other people outside of Israel to meet his own ends and his own purposes for his own glory. Okay? So in verse 14, Elijah is saying, this is what God says. He says, the jar of flour shall not be spent, and the jug of oil shall not be empty until the day the Lord sends rain upon the earth. In verse 15, and she went and did as Elijah said. Notice the instant obedience there. Remember, this isn't a God that she knows personally. He said, this is the Lord your God, right? But Elijah is saying, go ahead and do this. And, she's already made clear, this is what my intentions are. Elijah says, the Lord says, the flour's not going to run out. The oil's still going to drip. So go and do what I've told you, blah, blah, blah. And she, okay. And she turns around. That shows more obedient faith probably from that woman than what you've seen in Israel's history at that time. I think that's a big point that's probably being emphasized there when we're talking about that, though. But here, what we're seeing is we're seeing the power of God at work in this situation, where from a human perspective, we look around us and we think that, man, what is anybody going to do? How am I going to take care of myself? How am I going to take care of my family? When God has his eye out on his own, he knows what to do. And it might go even beyond, what we might understand and conceive of humanly in order to make those things happen. I've heard stories of people just even financially as it relates to, ministries and things like that, where they have a certain need. And then out of the blue, God provides it for them. And it comes from people. They don't know who it is. Sometimes it might be anonymous or something else. But, they don't know. Nobody else knows the financial need that they have. It just, hey, there's an envelope here and there's this money there. Who could have dropped it here? I don't know. And they don't know, but it's like that God met that need for a particular situation, for a particular ministry, or for a need to help these people out, so forth and so on, whatever. So, yeah, from a human perspective, things look impossible, but God has a way of working things out. And even in those situations that I was just talking to you about, couldn't it be just as much where God commands, quote unquote? Well, I shouldn't put quote unquote, because it is really actually a command, because God is working, in people and moving people to work according to his will a lot of times. Just as he commanded the ravens, and just as he commanded the widow here, that he commands other people to work in a way to fulfill his ends in meeting the needs of his people. Very much so, probably. But here he says in verse 15, and she went and did as Elijah said, and she and he and her household ate for many days. So God had their back. Not just Elijah's now, but now he's taking care of Elijah and he's taking care of this widow. In verse 16 testifies to what was already said before. It says, the jar of flour was not spent, neither did the jug of oil become empty, according to the word of the Lord that he spoke by Elijah. And you got to imagine, from this Gentile pagan, what this says, how this speaks to her. And it's, this speaks to her even more, like I said, even in the next passage, right? Because the widow's son dies. And she kind of has a little bit of a shift of things here. Her own mindset comes out in the open in verse 18. What have you against me, O man of God? You have come to me to bring my sin to remembrance and to cause the death of my son. So, a little discombobulated, doesn't know what's going on, but God uses Elijah to raise the son from the dead. And then, as I read to you earlier, verse 24, and the woman said to Elijah, now I know that you are a man of God and that the word of the Lord in your mouth is the truth. I guess one thing, if you wanted to draw from this here, even from this kind of intention from the text, is that even with how God works in your life, it could be that maybe in whatever context, whatever situation we're dealing with here in the 21st century, that God might use you as a conduit of his grace to other people. Okay? Now, again, we're not talking about a one-for-one comparison here. What we're going through here is, I wouldn't see necessarily as, God is judging his church or something like that, just as he judges Israel in 1 Kings 17. No. But, again, the whole thing is tough time, God providing for his people, his faithful people, his people, the church, in whatever way that looks like. God works things out in whatever way that he does and he chooses to, again, for our good and for his glory. But what if even in those instances, in some of those instances, God might use us in the midst of that situation to be able to be conduits of God's grace to somebody else who doesn't know him? and who can witness and behold the wonder of what God does in and through us, so that they can be reached, with the gospel, with the message of Jesus Christ and that sort of thing. I mean, that's not outside of God's ability either. So, I mean, but again, I'm not saying, again, just reminding you, we're not making a one-for-one comparison. But again, what I hope that you see as we've looked at this passage is that, God, just the way that God provides for his people and how God reveals himself to others. And so that's what really struck me as I was reading that passage. Again, just as part of my regular Bible reading, and just with just current things that are going on, especially with the economy, high prices are hitting all of us. The value of all of our dollars are being eroded. Okay. But that doesn't mean that God can't come through for his people. Doesn't mean he's going to shower you down with luxury cars and things like that so that you're super insulated or anything like that. He's just one who will meet your needs, okay, in whatever way that looks like. And he's certainly able to do that. You might look around here and even you hear the economic forecasts of things and saying that things are not going to get better. If they are, it's not going to be anytime soon. Let's just put it that way. What are we going to do? What is God going to do? Is God not able to see us through and still provide for our needs? Of course he's able. Of course he's able. Okay. And it's just kind of the inspiring sort of thing that was kind of running through my mind as I was reading that passage there in 1 Kings 17. And I thought, I'll just, and later I just kind of decided, I think maybe I'll just share that on the next podcast. But anyway, I mean, there you see, we serve an awesome God, and nothing is outside of his ability or outside of his control. Even the bringing on of the not ideal situation of the drought. I mean, not ideal from a human perspective. God has a purpose in that. Of course, we know that as we read through Scripture. But even though God brought that about, God also at the same time knows how to take care of his own. So he can take care of his own and still accomplish his purposes with whatever he's doing, on the other side there. And the same is true today. And so I would hope that, all of us who are believers in Christ can take heart in that. And that we don't have to worry. We can go right back to the words of Jesus there in Matthew chapter 6. Don't worry about your life, what you'll eat or what you'll drink, or about your body, what you will wear. So it comes back to the same principle. And hopefully in seeing God at work in narrative form, in actual narrative form, in actual historical narrative form, we can be encouraged, by just seeing what God is able to do. And some of you might have testimony stories, maybe not with what we're going through now, maybe you do. But I mean, even in times past. And those are the kinds of stories that really encourage people, and it encourages me, and I love hearing those stories. So, but anyway, so that's what we have for this, just as far as the passage goes, and everything. And I just thought that I would share that with you, and I hope that you've been blessed by it. Okay, so we will leave it there. Next week we will look at something else, and I don't know what that is. It's not nailed down 100%. What we'll look at next time. So again, I apologize. We'll figure it out, just like I got this week figured out. So, but I pray that it will be good, and I'm confident that it will be if the Lord leads me. So, so we will leave it there for now. If you enjoy the show and you haven't done so already, I would encourage you to subscribe to my show on Apple Podcasts, also on iHeartRadio, YouTube, or Spotify. You can also follow me, Steve Gill, on Twitter. The handle is @LTScripts. That's LTSERIPTS, which stands for Loving the Scriptures. And don't forget to, if you haven't done so already, to buy a copy of my book, Signs of the End. What did Jesus say about his own return and the events that point to it? That's by me, Steve Gill. Amazon.com, BarnesandNoble.com. I will leave a link in the episode description so that you can click on it, go there, and order yourself a copy. All right, friends. Well, I enjoyed this examination of Scripture. I hope that you did as well. My name is Steve Gill, and I will see you right back here next time. Bye now.